Hi, I'm Paul Comfort, and on this episode of Transit Unplugged, we interview Dr. Kaan Yildizgöz. He is the host of Mobility Redefined, a new sister podcast of Transit Unplugged, powered by Modaxo for Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Our discussion is going to explore his vision, mission, and impact of the podcast, some about how we know each other and how we got to this point, and his background. He's got a big background in public transportation, including a stint as one of the top leaders at UITP, the International Transport Union. We'll talk about how his podcast complements Transit Unplugged, why public transportation leaders should tune in, and the last part of the podcast, we talk about current trends in mobility, how they compare and contrast between Asia, Europe, and Africa, and the Middle East, and here in the United States and Canada and Australia. I think it's a fascinating podcast interview with Dr. Kaan, who's a good friend of mine. Enjoy this wide-ranging conversation about our new sister podcast, Mobility Redefined. This is Transit Unplugged. I'm Paul Comfort. And on today's episode, we have a special guest, my dear friend, Dr. Kaan Yildizgöz, who is host of Mobility Redefined, a sister podcast to Transit Unplugged. Welcome to the show, Kaan.
Thank you so much, Paul, inviting me to Transit Unplugged, our sister podcast.
That's right. Dr. Kaan and I got to know each other maybe a year or two ago when you were still vice president of UITP. I interviewed you, I think, at the UITP summit, maybe in Dubai. Is that right?
It was in Barcelona.
Barcelona,
Paul,
that's it.
2 years ago. It was a good conversation that we had there.
Yeah, that was great. And so, Kaan, tell us about what you did there, because I think that's important, and how you got interested in transportation. And now you're like one of the world's top leaders at promoting public transportation.
Thank you so much, Paul, once again for inviting me to Transit Unplugged. That's my second time being guest, but this time with a different hat. When I was talking last time to you, I was representing UITP. My last position at UITP I was senior director and management board member of UITP, mainly in charge of UITP's operations outside Europe, and also it is main services like UITP Summit, Global Summit, UITP Training Academy. So I worked there many years, and before this one, I was working for multiple transport organizations in the world, like Roads and Transport Authority of Dubai, Turkish Airlines, Metro Istanbul. And actually, I'm a transport person because I'm a son of a bus mechanic. I'm a son of bus mechanic.
Right?
I grew up in the workshops. You know, when I was at the primary school, when I was at the secondary school, when I was coming back from the school, I was always going to visit my father, and then I spent all my spare time at the bus workshop. So I guess that this made me very much interested in public transport.
Yeah, that's right. And you're a doctor. So what are you a doctor of?
My PhD is on transportation, certainly. So particularly on the ride-hailing and new mobility, how this technology is changing the way that we are moving around. And like you, I was many years giving lectures or part-time professor in different universities. Currently, I'm also an adjunct professor in a university. So I guess that, this is our passion, the public transport and mobility, how moving people in the cities all around is our passion. And in my spare time, I'm trying to contribute to do academic development as well, with authoring some books like you, Paul, with supporting and getting together with different people to exchange with them. So that's what I could be telling.
Kaan, you and I had a week together a few months ago, last year, 2024, where we were in Mexico together at the Quadrants. And we talked about the fact that the Transit Unplugged podcast, while it's a global endeavor and we have guests from all over, we primarily focus on the Western world, on North America, a little bit of Latin America, Australia, et cetera. And even our company, Modaxo, is kind of divided that way, where we have two halves of the world. The other half of the world is Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. And really, they have unique issues, I think, when it comes to transportation. I've noticed that when I visit there. I mean, we have a lot of the same issues, and today we'll talk about them. But we felt like they needed a voice specifically for them. And you've got such a great background, already a public speaker, already, well-known in the industry and connected with scores of top leaders around the world through your role at UITP. You seem like the perfect host for this program. And now you've kicked it off, right? Tell us a little bit about Mobility Redefined.
Thank you so much, Paul. Actually, we are very lucky as Mobility Redefined because we have a role model in front of us, Transit Unplugged, and I have you as well to learn from your practices. And we launched Mobility Redefined in 6 months ago it's still having the baby steps, this podcast. And like you say, we are mainly focusing on Europe, Asia, and Africa for that podcast. So we are having different industry leaders, different public transport or urban mobility leaders coming and joining us in this podcast. They are sharing their experiences with us in different areas, in the areas of, let's say, decarbonization, resilience, workforce-related challenges, transformation of the mobility. We are discussing with them best practices. And sometimes, I'm asking them questions that, you tell us all about the good things that you are doing, but what were the failures? Can you share some also the worst practices with us? And I'm very surprised. They are very open. They are very honest to share these practices with us. And what I would like to tell is that we are really observing a strong transformation. Maybe sometimes since we are living this, we may not be noticing how the world is changing. And this kind of, let's say, podcast, this kind of interviews that we are having under Mobility Redefined or live CEO roundtables taking place at the different events are really giving us an opportunity to monitor what is happening in the world and sharing the practices with different people. And maybe I will give you one example on this, Paul. First, urban transport related conference in the world took place in 1886. And I don't know if you have any idea, if you may guess, what was the topic of this first transport congress taking place in 1886?
It probably wasn't battery electric buses, was it?
It was not about electric buses, but it was about, on how to get best performance from horses. This was
is that right? Powering what the current form of energy was, the horses.
In my former office, I was having a book that was explaining the recommendations of this conference, and there was even a formula written as a recommendation of this congress saying that is the ideal way to prepare the horse food. Like this much corn, it needs to come from this part of the region. That should be the oil. It should come from this part of the region. What I want to tell is that today we are talking about artificial intelligence. We are talking about electrification, hydrogen. We are talking totally different things. And when we even look at 20 years ago, we were not discussing about the smartphones that change our landscape totally. So here, what we are trying to do is that mobility landscape is changing very fast now, and we are trying to discuss with all our guests about how different people can learn from each other, from the practices of different leaders that they already experienced.
That's great. Yeah, it's one of the cool things about our industry is in the public transportation or public transport, as they like to call it in your side of the world, is that we share best practices. We're not competitors. And that's what the podcast is really about, right? To me, the Transit Unplugged podcast is the reason it's unplugged is I want to have the same kind of conversations that you mentioned, where we can just have a conversation and they can tell me what worked, what didn't work. The people that listen to it are people that are interested in this topic, so they learn from one another. And I also like to showcase public transit leaders, ones that I think are doing a great job, because they don't get an opportunity very often to kind of strut their stuff. I was one. I know, having been the CEO of the Baltimore transit system, the only time you really get to talk in the media is when there's a problem, right? When there's a bus that had a crash or a derailment or the drivers are on strike, and you have to respond to a crisis in real time. You don't get to kind of talk about the great things that are happening. So this show, and hopefully I think your show is about that too. I listened to some of them recently, is that same thing. Tell us about some of the guests that you've had on and kind of what you all have talked about.
There were different guests that I already hosted. So I hosted some ministers. For example, I recently hosted the transport minister of Chile. Right. It was very interesting. The Chile is because, they are having a strong transformation in terms of the decarbonization of the buses. They have the largest electric bus fleet now outside of China. I was talking with him about how they are managing this electrification transformation process. And the minister himself is also a BRT expert. I was discussing with him about how Latin American cities started the BRT revolution all around the world because it was the cradle of the BRT systems. I recently hosted the deputy mayor of the city of Medina from Saudi Arabia, because it was a very interesting conversation, because they host every year Hajj, which is getting more people, more visitors than Olympics. Just imagine a city is hosting Olympics every year. So how to organize transport, how to organize mobility around this, it was very interesting. Or I was recently discussing with the Deputy Transport Minister of Spain. She was sharing with me about the high-speed rail revolution in Spain. It's very interesting how to connect the cities, with the high speed to create more economic efficiency, to create more, let's say, economic value. And now the Spain is the leader in Europe in terms of their total high-speed rail network. So I think it's also good learning for me. I got good feedback until now, but of course there is still a lot of, way to improve it. It is still at the 6 months old podcast, and I can invite from with this opportunity all the listeners of Transit Unplugged, also from their favorite podcast app. They can search for Mobility Redefined, and they can subscribe to this podcast as well. We are sister podcast of Transit Unplugged. We are a complementary time to time. We will be with Paul. We will be having this joint podcast together, and we will have some separate editions. And the Mobility Redefined will be mostly focusing on the Asia, Middle East, and Africa. And we are also trying to produce some knowledge pieces from let's say from this podcast, and we share these ones as a report. As some articles also with our listeners.
Yeah. And we just shared the podcast that you did with the minister from Chile as a supplemental podcast to our subscribers. So, and some details about it, about how often are you doing a podcast, about how long is it, those kind of things.
The podcast average length is around, let's say, 30 to 40 minutes. So
okay. That's like ours.
It's very ideal for everyone to listen when they are going to the office, right. Or when they have some, let's say, morning exercises and so on. And what we do is that we have two type of, let's say, podcasts. One is every month on the first Monday, we are having a monthly podcast. And also we have a lot of bonus editions. And when we look at these bonus editions, time to time, we do some in-depth interview about a specific topic with some leader. We put this as a bonus edition during the month. And also we are conducting, like you, Paul, a lot of live CEO roundtables at different events. And when we go at these events and then we conduct the live CEO roundtables at the events, we are converting them into the podcast and share with our listeners as well.
What conference were you just recently at? And you did a roundtable there? Was that a UITP conference?
There was a Singapore International Transport Conference
Yes.
we have done in November. We did a roundtable. There, and then before this one, we were in Berlin for InnoTrans.
That's right.
The InnoTrans is the largest, let's say, transport-related event of the world, taking place 2 times a year. We did 2 roundtables in Berlin at InnoTrans. One of them was focusing on the funding. And now, as you know, the funding is the main challenge of what many transit agencies, public transport authorities are facing all around the world. We had a chance to discuss about the funding. Another one was about the innovation for the future, how we can innovate, co-innovate as different stakeholders for the future of mobility. And when I was having the live CEO roundtable in Singapore, I had also a guest from Americas, my close friend Nadine Lee, CEO of
Lee, yeah.
Yeah, she also joined. Thanks to her for this live CEO roundtable in Singapore.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. I'm so glad you're able to do all that. There's a lot to cover in our industry. Like, for instance, we're just starting 2025. I've got like 23 trips booked in the next 30 weeks. So there's only so many places I can cover. Like I was invited like 4 times to go to Intertrans. I just couldn't fit it into my schedule. So wonderful that we're able to kind of divide and conquer, as they say, all the thoughts that are out there. And that's what I want to ask you about next is, what are some of the trends that you're seeing around the world? Because I know that there's similarities, but there's also regional differences. So talk to us about, Dr. Kaan, what you're seeing around the world.
Certainly, Paul. One very obvious trend that we discuss all around the world, and in particular in, let's say, Europe, Asia, and Africa, is decarbonization. When we talk about decarbonization, it's mostly from the perspective of the buses and the taxis. So bus transport, if you look for the public transport industry today, if I'm not wrong, every day there is around 1.3 billion trips are happening by public transport in cities. And 85%, nearly 85% of all these public transport trips are happening by the buses. So decarbonization of the bus transport is an important discussion point. And in particular on this one, we see China. China is really the leader in terms of deploying and transition to the zero emission fleets. Like they have nearly 400,000 electric buses running now Or India is another one that we can give as an example. They have a program for deploying around 50,000 buses during the next 4 years. But there are some challenges coming together with this one. The challenges implementing electric vehicles while maintaining operational efficiency. It's an important thing, meeting the customer expectations at the same time, the funding of it and scaling it up. So this is one trend that what I see. And I guess that this is also an important area of discussion in Americas. Am I wrong on this, Paul?
No, you're right. It is an area of discussion, and we'll talk all about it when we come back after this quick break. We're back with some communication jiu-jitsu with my friends Rebecca Klein and Keith Scott. Thanks for being on the show, guys. Today we're talking about change management. This is a topic that everybody in the transit industry is involved in right now because there's so much change coming from Washington, coming from their own communities, what people expect from transit agencies, new people coming in. This is a hot topic, isn't it? I guess probably any industry.
It is. It's a huge topic and people are talking about it everywhere. And the one thing people can't stand is change. When you go in the supermarket and they've moved the aisle of food, people get frustrated.
When someone sits in your seat at the dining room table.
When I go into the pantry, if my wife has moved something from where I normally thought it was, I cannot find it. It's just like, it's not where I thought it was supposed to be. It may only be one shelf up, but I can't find it. How do we manage this change, guys? So I guess we have to adapt to change, right? Because that's the only constant or something?
We do, and we have to be a little psychologically tricky with ourselves with it. Because when we call these things change, as Keith said, people are terrified of change. And instead of calling it a change, talk about what it is. It's an enhancement, it's an update, an improvement, but be specific. That way people don't close down.
And one of the biggest things you can do with change is to keep your mouth shut. Active listening. Listening to bond in order to bring a sense of understanding, but also listening to bond instead of listening to respond. How many times do people listen to someone? They're not thinking about the real thing they're saying. They're thinking, how do I have a clever comeback to what they said? How do I argue instead of figuring out how do I bond and create a connection?
I love that. So it's really about using this change management as an opportunity to build relationships as well, to help you kind of bond through that, to change together.
Exactly. When you really slow down and listen to someone without formulating your response, it's amazing what you pick up and how much better the conversation moves than when you're too focused on what you're about to say.
Many times we sit and listen to someone talk and we never say a word. And then at the end, they say, man, that was a great conversation. It's like that.
Yes.
Because a lot of people feel like nobody in the world listens to them.
Yes.
Spend time listening. That's obviously the old saying is why we have 2 ears and 1 mouth.
That's right. I recently had dinner with a guy, and he was talking about a subject matter that I didn't know anything about. And so I was super interested. And because I'm always about learning, so I hardly said anything the whole dinner. Like he probably talked 45 minutes and I talked 5 or 10. And when we were done, he was really connected with me, and I felt connected with him, and I felt like I'd really learned something. But I guess that's that time during that change management. If you can just listen, that really helps. Helps reduce friction and barriers.
Absolutely. And even the fact that you were listening, he or she was reading your body language.
Yes.
You develop a closeness. We don't always have to be talking when we're in the same room. Just being together, observing each other, you build a bond over time. I think people forget that many times.
And the more you listen, you're able to see what the layer is underneath what's being said, because conversations are as much about what someone is not saying as what they are telling you. And you can listen for those holes and then ask questions.
And how do you lead by example in all of this?
Or leading by example means you've learned to be adaptable. You've learned that change happens, that change is a constant. Everything is changing at all times. And having a positive attitude towards that change, not fighting the change. There is nothing at this second that's not going to be different 2 seconds from now. That is the reality. And once you realize the reality, you've got to surf with the wave no matter which direction it's going.
And stopping yourself from the temptation to figure out why the change occurred. There are a lot of things we cannot control. And we waste an awful lot of time thinking about, well, what if it had been this way? What if they didn't change this? It's about accepting this is where we are and this is how we are moving forward.
And how do we empower our teams during change management?
listening and involving employees. When it's all done at the top and employees have no clue what's going to happen, that's when rumors start. That's when everybody starts talking because they feel that a change is occurring. They don't have the information. And when you don't have the information, you fill it in your head and it's usually wrong. We create weird scenarios to things. The amount of times we're called out for drama and gossip that never needed to happen is often.
Often when people are filling in the blanks of what they're not being told. We've been called out to across the country to work with people because they weren't told what was happening. They created their own stories and those stories travel fast.
Yeah, I think it's so important to create context for everyone and give them the big picture. I remember I worked, a friend of mine was a lady that worked on in Detroit on an auto manufacturing line. And her job was just to do one thing every day, pointing out a vendor over and over and over again all day. She said, but they never took us through the whole process and showed us where my work fit into the context and the end product. And she felt like that really would have helped her kind of see where her fit was, right, in the organization.
It also helps your self-esteem to know you're part of something bigger.
Yeah, I like that. And during this whole time, I guess the final point I wanted to ask you about was about consistent messaging.
Yes, making sure that all people are receiving the messaging. Sometimes when change occurs, one department is told something a month before another. That creates a lot of friction. Making sure that you're strategic about revealing everything at the same time.
That's good. Very good. Well, thank you. So as we, any final closing thoughts on the topic of change management?
Be open to change. It's occurring all the time. It will never go away.
Thank you, Keith Scott. And thank you, Rebecca Klein, for helping us manage and adapt to change.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we're back with Dr. Kaan Yildizgöz, who is the host of Mobility Redefined, a sister podcast to Transit Unplugged. When we left you, we were talking about what are the hot trends in the world. And Kaan mentioned that decarbonization is a big one in public transportation around the world. And he's right. It is a big topic of discussion here in the United States, especially. We have a new administration in Washington, the Trump administration, and they have started to give direction to move away from battery electric power. Recent actions taken by the administration that I've heard about are things like taking away battery electric charging equipment at federal buildings and reevaluating what's called the Low-No Grant program here in the U.S. is what I understand is going to happen. This is a funding program through which the federal government has helped fund battery electric buses, but also hydrogen buses and others. And I haven't heard any concerns from anyone publicly yet in the new administration about the concept of zero emission buses, just the battery electric side of things. So a lot of agencies, like I was just out west and went to agencies in Las Vegas and in Tucson. Prior to that, I've been in places like Kansas City and other locations, and they are doubling down on a fuel called compressed natural gas, CNG, which is a low emission fuel that is used a lot around the world. I know when I was up in Western Canada, the same kind of thing. They're looking at, the power that comes out of the ground right underneath their provinces, so they can get it rather cheaply. They don't have to truck it in or whatever. Other places, like in Las Vegas and others I was just at, they're trucking in hydrogen, and they still are committed to that. Now, a lot of transit agencies in the U.S. and Canada have political or governmental mandates to move towards zero emission, and they're moving that way through battery electric buses. But other folks like my friend Doran Barnes in Foothills outside of Los Angeles has decided that decarbonization is important to them, but they're going to move more toward the hydrogen side of things. And same with Sunline Transit in California, where they built a plant many years ago where they can create their own hydrogen. So it's a hot topic of discussion. A lot of people have invested a lot of money, transit agencies have, in the infrastructure that is required, even beginning brand new buildings, garages where they could store their electric buses inside and be charged in there. And now there's a concern and a question about whether the federal government is going to fund those going forward. And I think the answer looks to be probably not, but it's not 100% clear yet here in the U.S. what's happening there. So it is a hot topic of discussion. As a matter of fact, at our Think Transit conference, I put together a roundtable of people from New Flyer, which is the largest manufacturer of buses here in the U.S., from EO Charging, which is one of the largest charging companies in the country, and a CEO of a transit system from Kansas City, Frank White, and the head of a maintenance department of one of America's largest bus companies. The other thing is basically, Kaan, is that I think everyone shares the goals. We want a clean environment. It's how we get there. Transit has to be resilient as well. I knew I had a friend that ran a bus service on the East Coast of America. And he said, Paul, if I turn my whole fleet electric and a bad storm comes like Hurricane Sandy did a couple years ago and knocks off all the power, how are we going to charge those buses? And my job is to help evacuate the city. So all those concerns are around now, and we're all working toward the same goal, which is safe, efficient, reliable transit with world-class customer service. How we get there is very different.
Today, I mean, Paul, here, you also linked the subject to have another trend, an important topic, which is resilience. And when we talk about resilience, I mean, it's certainly very essential area for public transportation and urban mobility. And one element which I would like to tell is that we mostly approach the resilience topic from the angle of environmental or from the angle of disasters or external events. There is one important topic to be discussed is about resilient governance, resilience in terms of the funding. So how we can make public transport more resilient in terms of the public, in terms of the funding, in terms of the governance. So that's a discussion as well in Europe, in Asia and Africa. What we see a lot nowadays is that more authorities are looking for different ways in terms of making public transport systems more resilient. We see changing of contractual relations between authorities and operators. We see that the authorities are positioning themselves more in the area of the, let's say, planning the services and contracting out to the operators. We are seeing more coming of the gross cost contracts between authorities and operators in place in more cities, more authorities. I was in Nigeria last week when I was discussing with the CEO of the Lagos Metropolitan Transport Authority. So we had a very detailed discussion about the future of the gross cost contracts and the how to share the role between authorities and operators, and also the cost coverage ratios. I mean, before the COVID-19 in Europe, let's say the average cost coverage ratio for public transport operations was around, let's say, 40 to 50%. Today, we all know that this is lower than the pre-COVID levels. In Asian networks, many of the Asian networks, particularly for metros or the buses, they were all covering their cost and they were even making some profit. And today, they are facing a lot of challenges. So how we can make public transport more resilient in terms of funding and governance side is also one important area of discussion what I am seeing in my conversations with different transport leaders.
Yeah, same thing here, man. Matter of fact, if I had to break down what I think the hot trends are right now in the first quarter of 2025, they are fueling, funding, and faring. That's what's happening now in the US and Canada and Australia. I was just in Australia, as you know, right before Thanksgiving, American Thanksgiving, and it all resonated with them. They said, yes, fueling. What are we going to do with fueling? Faring. Are we raising fares? Are we charging fares? Are we not going to charge? Like I was just in Tucson. They're probably the largest American city that has still decided to not charge fares. Their transit system is free, completely free. Other transit systems that are larger, that have a bigger fare box recovery ratio, they've not been able to do that. My friend outside of Boston, Miva, Noah there, he's done the same thing. Their system is doubled down on zero fares. But mostly what you're seeing in the U.S. is an actual reinforcement of fares. The larger transit systems that don't get federal operating dollars because they're over 200,000 people, they're putting up bigger fare gates so you can't jump over them. They've lost tens of millions of dollars of queue jumpers and people that have kind of got on. Everybody else is paying, but this guy's not. Is that fair? Probably not. So yeah, it's a big hot topic here, resilience and contracting, Kaan. I'm glad you brought that up. That's a topic here as well. As you know, I work with the North American Transit Alliance, which represents some of the world's and America's largest contractors. And transit agencies are looking to contractors because a lot of times they can bring global experience, like they're working all over Europe, seeing that, RATP, DAV, TransDAV, Kills, all these big international companies. They can bring that expertise here and probably do it a little more efficiently when it comes to cost. You may be able to actually save some money. The transit agency can, is what studies that UITP and ENO have found for us, is that sometimes there's greater efficiencies there, plus the expertise. So I know that you all actually contract out more work in Europe than we do here in America. In America, usually only the paratransit and specialized services, and sometimes fixed route, but usually fixed route public bus service is done in-house with in-house employees. Another hot topic here, Kaan, I'd like to hear your take on is digitalization. That's happening here in America. Everyone wants to, Uberize their transit, right? Where you could look at your phone and you could see where the bus is, and there's a lot more tools, right?
No, I mean, there is a race to increase the ridership, maximize efficiency, and enhance passenger experience, all while controlling the cost. So This is where we can really use the digitalization. And then we are discussing about artificial intelligence. That's on the lips of everyone today. How we can get the most benefit from artificial intelligence, how we can get the most benefits in terms of increasing the availability of our vehicles, increasing the punctuality of public transport. That's maybe what I can tell to you is also a link with your previous point of free fare public transport. In this part of the world, also free fare public transport is being discussed, and there are a lot of practices. And what we say is that, that was also the opinion of UITP. And then today what we advocate in Mobility Redefined is that we are giving the message to the cities that instead of giving the free fare public transport, it might be working more in case if we invest this amount of financial support to increase the ridership of public transport, increase the service quality of public transport, because people, their reaction, their elasticity to the change in the service quality is more than the change in the fare levels. And certainly this can happen with the better digitalization and deployment into the public transport.
And what else are you seeing there? What other trends globally are you seeing that you want to share with us?
One very significant area is that the talent, workforce. So I know that this is being discussed a lot all around the world. So globally in public transport industry, 30 million people are working for. It's even more than aviation sector, It's even more than aviation sector. 30 million people are working. And then I was recently reading a report that was prepared for Europe, particularly for bus and coach sector. It was coming from IRU, International Road Union, and they were telling that there are now currently more than 100,000 driver positions are empty for the bus and coach sector. I was in previously last year, before you go to Australia, when I was having a trip to Australia, in some agencies, they told me that they have around 30% of the roles in the agency are empty now. They are vacant now. So this is a very important area in many parts of the world. Finding the right drivers, retaining them, attracting the top talents to the public transport industry. That's a very important focus of the discussion as well in this part of the world in terms of trends in public transport.
Well, I encourage people to take a listen to your podcast. They can listen to it wherever they get their podcasts. I listen to it on Apple Podcasts. That's where I listen to your show there. That's where I listen to most podcasts personally, but I know a lot of people are on Spotify and other places as well. What do you have upcoming? What's some new subjects you have coming for upcoming podcasts? Do you have any planned out?
What I can tell is that we have big plans for the UITP Summit taking place in Hamburg in June. We were planning to organize some live CEO roundtables at this occasion to discuss about two different topics. One area will be certainly touching to this free fare public transport. That's a hot topic today. And we will be discussing about decarbonization and the talent in the sector. We are having some of the individual podcasts coming this month and the next month, where we will be exploring about the roles of authorities and the changing governance frameworks all around the region, together with the funding-related challenges. And of course, there will be some podcasts about artificial intelligence. Certainly, we will put a focus about artificial intelligence and how really this can help us in public transport industry, both for the operations side, but also for the regulators, for better planning and monitoring the system.
That's great. One last thing I want to mention before I let you go, and that is you wrote a book on taxi cabs and using microtransit and transit. I'm really interested in that topic. You and I have talked about it a couple times before. Where can people get that book if they're interested in that? And tell us about the book a little bit.
Yeah, I wrote two books about the taxis, actually. One was Taxis in the Era of Digitalization. This book was published in 2018. And I have another book, Taxis in the Era of Coronavirus, that was published during the COVID-19 period. Both these books are available in Amazon. And then I recently wrote a white paper for one of Modaxo companies, Trapeze, about how to reform the taxi transport. This is available in the internet. If the listeners have an interest, they can have a look. That's putting a framework about for cities to improve their taxi type of transportation, taxis and ride hailing. Maybe we can call them as a point-to-point transportation or hiring a car with driver. And I put a white paper about this, so this can be easily downloadable as well from internet.
Well, Kaan, wrapping up today's conversation, I think that what I said to Kelly Chapman at the end of our TV show we did in Australia is the more things are different, the more they are the same. Even though there are different individual distinctions by our geographies, the hot topics you're talking about, decarbonization, resilience, digitalization, redefining public transport, workforce development, They're the same topics all over the world, and we can learn from each other. So I encourage people in our listening audience to take a listen to Mobility Redefined, where you can hear some specific answers to how people are solving these challenges in other parts of the world. Thank you again for being our guest today, Dr. Kaan Yildizgöz.
Thank you so much, Paul, for inviting me. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you for joining this edition of the Transit Unplugged podcast featuring Dr. Kaan Yildizgöz, host of Mobility Redefined. Here is a word from Julie Gates.
My name is Julie Gates. I'm the executive producer of the podcast, and I want to thank you for listening to this show. And if you're listening right now, I have a favor to ask of you. Would you please give us your feedback about the Transit Unplugged podcast? We're running a survey right now to help us make decisions on what to do with the show moving forward. So if there's anything you absolutely love about the podcast, please let us know. And if there's anything that makes you want to hit your head against the wall, we need to know that too. It's really important to us to deliver the show you want to hear week after week. And as time evolves, the show needs to evolve. We can only evolve with your help. So please head over to transitunplugged.com/survey. It's completely anonymous, and your feedback will help us make our show better week after week. You can find the survey at transitunplugged.com/survey. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll catch you next week.